Is a war with Pakistan inevitable after Pahalgam? Here's what India must do. Top Indo-Pak strategies from a retired Indian captain. Don't miss a moment. Listen through to the end. The incident in Pahalgam. It lands heavy, doesn't it?
It really does.
You feel that immediate tightening, that very human surge wanting,
Yeah.
well, wanting something to be done.
Yeah, a very natural response when something like this happens.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There's
Yeah.
a deep-seated frustration and, a desire for justice that we all feel.
But what we're aiming for in this deep dive isn't just about that initial reaction.
Right.
We're trying to look past the immediate headlines, maybe unpack the bigger picture of strategy, potential responses,
Yeah.
India and Pakistan.
Exactly, because in these moments, you're just hit with so much information, so many sort of loud opinions, especially online.
Yeah, the noise.
Our goal here is to try and cut through some of that noise, maybe get to a more thoughtful understanding of just how complex this all is.
Okay, so looking at potential responses. One of the first things that came up was this difference. Tactical versus strategic. What's the distinction there?
Well, a tactical response would be, the more immediate, localized reaction.
Like a direct counterstrike after Pahalgam.
Yeah, exactly that. The kind of thing you see a lot of people calling for right after something happens.
Makes sense. Feels direct.
It does. But the critical question is, does that kind of move risk a bigger escalation? Especially when you think about the other side, maybe? Maybe seeing their stakes differently.
Right. There's that analogy you mentioned about arguing with a cab driver. Different stakes.
Yeah, that was it. Imagine like a heated argument. One person's just trying to get where they're going, right? Their destination.
Right, okay.
The other person, they might be fighting for their actual livelihood in that moment.
So they might push harder.
They might be willing to escalate things in a way the other person just wouldn't because they feel they have less to lose maybe in that specific situation.
So applying that here, Pakistan might perceive their risks differently than India does.
That's the idea. We have to consider their perception of risk versus ours when we figure out a response. It's not just about our view.
So a quick, forceful action, it might feel satisfying right then, but it doesn't necessarily stop it happening again.
That's really a central point, yeah. Looking back, those kinds of kinetic responses haven't really prevented these incidents from recurring.
So just focusing on like how many casualties or how much damage.
It might miss the more fundamental point.
Which is, how do you actually deter them? What's the fundamental aspect?
It really comes down to the nature of the price you impose.
Okay.
It has to hit the decision makers, the ones, green lighting these actions.
Not just symbolic.
Right. Because a tit-for-tat response, say, harming innocent civilians across the border, unfortunately, that just mirrors the message of the original attack. It doesn't really target those responsible in the establishment.
It almost sends the message, we play by the same rules?
Exactly. It can reinforce their thinking. See, they do it too, which brings us to really understanding the adversary's motivations.
And that's where the King Solomon's baby analogy came in, highlighting different priorities.
Yeah, that analogy helps illustrate how priorities might diverge quite sharply.
How so?
Well, imagine a government, right? Its main focus is the well-being, the progress of its citizens.
Okay, you hope so.
They might be much more hesitant, to risk things that jeopardize that progress. But a military establishment, one that maybe prioritizes its own power, its own relevance within society, they might have a very different calculation. Their own survival, their grip on power might unfortunately take precedence over their citizens' well-being sometimes.
So for them, keeping a certain level of tension going might actually serve their own internal interests.
Precisely. In that kind of context, conflict or the threat of it can become a tool, a way to pursue political goals when maybe diplomacy isn't working for them.
And especially when dealing with an adversary they see as militarily weaker.
That's when asymmetric warfare becomes a key strategy for them.
Asymmetric, that's the weaker side, using unconventional methods, right, to inflict damage.
Exactly. They use the terrain, maybe differences in how much pain or casualties each side can tolerate.
Right.
And they aim to inflict what they see as unacceptable damage, but without relying on, tanks and planes necessarily.
So we can't just think in conventional military terms.
We really can't. We have to anticipate these unconventional tactics, focus on where they might see an advantage, even if it's not a direct military fight.
Just like that smaller force aiming for maximum disruption, maximum psychological impact through unexpected means.
And underestimating that approach, demeaning the enemy, that's a huge mistake.
Why is that?
Because it leads to strategic errors. You misjudge their capabilities or their resolve. Even a country with a, much smaller economy can cause significant disruption.
Divert resources, attention.
Absolutely. Think about the 26/11 Mumbai attacks.
Yeah, terrible. But you mentioned the long-term economic impact.
It's fascinating in a grim way. Those attacks, years later, still affect things. Increased security costs, hospitality, air travel. It adds up.
I hadn't really thought about it cascading like that.
And that's the point about terrorism as a tool for those who use it. It can be a disturbingly effective return on investment.
How do you mean?
A relatively small investment, a small group, can force a much larger entity to devote massive resources away from schools, hospitals, infrastructure.
More security. It's a grim calculation.
It really is. Which brings us back to thinking about responses beyond just, immediate military action.
Right. You mentioned 5 key elements of warfare.
Yeah, these are kind of the fundamentals you look at in any conflict situation. Firepower, mobility, command control, and logistics.
Okay, let's just quickly touch on those. Firepower, obvious, the ability to hit things.
Correct. Projecting force. Mobility is how you position that firepower, how you move your forces effectively.
Like the difference between a bow and arrow and an ICBM.
Exactly. Both deliver a payload, but the range, the application, vastly different. Command is the big picture, the strategic goal, the political intent.
Set by the leadership.
Yes. And control is how you translate that big idea into actual plans and make sure they're carried out on the ground.
Got it. And logistics.
Logistics. The absolutely essential but often invisible part, supplying troops, fuel, ammo, food, keeping the whole operation running.
Okay, so thinking through those elements.
Yeah.
How does that shape a strategic response beyond just a striking back?
Well, a strategic response could involve things that don't look military at first glance, like actively promoting tourism in Kashmir.
Tourism. That sounds almost counterintuitive right after an attack.
It does, doesn't it? But the thinking is you build such strong economic and social investment in the region.
Okay.
You make it so valuable, not just to India, but maybe internationally too, that any attack becomes an assault on a much wider set of interests.
So you raise the stakes for disruption.
Exactly. Offer incentives, invest in long-term businesses. Someone mentioned data centers leveraging the climate, the educated population. Maybe protect them with special economic zone rules.
You're essentially making the region a valuable asset for everyone involved.
Right. It's enhancing our own sort of non-military logistics and mobility in the region, making it harder, more costly for anyone to disrupt. It shifts the whole risk-reward calculation.
Interesting. So it's about integration, value building.
Yeah.
What about that other idea, building dossiers on Pakistani leaders? What's the strategy there?
That's more about information, psychological operations, perhaps.
Oh.
The idea is to potentially undermine their authority domestically, show a disconnect maybe between their public rhetoric and their, personal lifestyles or assets.
Aiming it at the Pakistani people.
Potentially. It connects back to that idea of why the military establishment might need tension with India.
To justify their own power, their budget.
Exactly. Like that analogy of a family clinging on to inherited assets or power.
And the comparison. Pakistani army is like the IAS in India, ISI, like the old IFS, in terms of aspiration.
Yeah, illustrating how central those institutions are perceived to be, the kind of power they represent within their society. Understanding that internal dynamic is, it's crucial.
Okay, shifting gears slightly. Strategic considerations. There's always that intense domestic pressure here, right? For a strong response, blood has to be seen.
Oh, absolutely. That pressure is real and understandable, but the caution is against actions that are purely, cosmetic.
Just for show.
Yeah. Responses that don't actually address the core problem or change the adversary's calculation, the focus needs to be on levers that really hurt them, the decision makers.
Even if those levers aren't visible or immediately satisfying to the public here.
Precisely. That example may be crude, of exposing personal assets. Not very optic, maybe, but potentially quite effective against certain individuals.
Compared to, say, a retaliatory strike with high casualties that might not actually bother the top leadership that much.
It's possible, yes. It's about understanding who your key audience is for any action. Who holds the key to change?
So the primary audience for our actions, maybe it isn't the general Pakistani public initially?
It's a complex calculation. While, ordinary people on both sides generally want peace, the immediate strategic focus often needs to be on influencing the calculus of those who actually wield power within Pakistan's establishment.
Got it. And there was also the point about civilians living in these conflict zones,
Yeah.
their position.
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult. They're often caught between militants and security forces, pressured by both, living in fear.
And the rules are different.
Very different. Security forces operate under rules of engagement. Terrorists obviously do not. That distinction is vital.
And while acknowledging that, yes, some locals might be indoctrinated.
We have to be incredibly careful about broad generalizations. Alienating whole communities is counterproductive.
It plays into the militants' hands.
It can, yeah. The analogy used was, isolated incidents elsewhere in India versus the continuous situation in Kashmir. Painting everyone with the same brush just damages the national fabric.
Okay. It was also mentioned that the nature of attack seems to have shifted over, say, the last 10, 15 years.
Yes, that's an important observation. The shift from attacks deep inside India to incidents more contained near the border.
What does that suggest?
It likely suggests an improvement in India's intelligence and counterterrorism capabilities, a better ability to contain the threat, perhaps.
A degree of success, maybe, even if the problem isn't gone?
Possibly. And related to that, the advice about interpreting government silence during these times.
Right. Not to assume nothing's happening.
Exactly. Silence doesn't necessarily mean inaction. Strategic communication is incredibly tricky in these situations.
There could be a lot going on behind the scenes.
A whole lot. Things that can't be made public immediately. So, we need to resist jumping to simplistic conclusions based on what we see or don't see right away.
Like watching a cricket match, but having no idea what the captain's overall strategy is.
That's a good way to put it. We don't have the full picture, the players do.
Okay. This leads to that idea of a constructive citizen response. What was suggested?
The idea floated was quite powerful, actually. Actively visiting Kashmir, spending money there.
As a form of resilience?
Exactly. It's a direct rejection of the terrorists' aim, which is to instill fear, to disrupt normal life, to isolate the region.
It sends a message, we won't be scared away.
Precisely. It reinforces integration, shows solidarity, and it also addresses that fear people might naturally feel.
The fear about visiting Kashmir, especially after an incident.
Right, but statistically speaking, everyday life, driving a car, other things, often carry higher risks.
We don't think about those the same way.
No. And while, look, there are no guarantees in life, only probabilities, security is typically heightened massively right after an incident. Paradoxically, it might even be safer temporarily.
It's about understanding the psychology of terror then.
Yes. It targets our reptilian brain, primal fear, bypassing rational thought.
Like that falling dream analogy, or mistaking a rope for a snake in the dark.
Exactly those. Gut reactions, often disproportionate. Terror removes that sense of agency, of control. That unpredictability is key.
Like the difference between a strict teacher you understand versus one who's completely unpredictable.
That's a great analogy. You can cope with strict but predictable. Unpredictable is terrifying. And the point was made, Pakistan's strategy has often relied on that element of unpredictable threat for decades.
Which makes that other analogy relevant, being chained to someone weaker but maybe seemingly irrational.
Yes. It highlights why just using overwhelming force might not work or could even backfire. It limits your options.
And cautions against those simplistic solutions like just break up Pakistan.
Right. Drawing a parallel to counterinsurgency.
Yeah.
Sometimes taking out a key leader without addressing the root causes just leads to something worse popping up.
So the long-term strategy needs to be different.
The suggestion is yes. Focus on draining the economic pipeline, making it harder for the military leadership to sustain conflict and maintain popular support for it.
Looking longer term. The potential for reconciliation was also mentioned. Despite everything.
Yeah, referencing history, France and Germany, for example. Bitter enemies, now partners. Given the sheer scale of populations in India, Pakistan, China, future positive relationships aren't impossible.
And these current conflicts, partly driven by resource competition.
That was a broader point. Competition over dwindling resources is a huge underlying factor globally. Incidents like Pahalgam, tragic as they are, can distract from these larger, slower burn threats.
Like climate change.
Exactly. The irony of focusing intensely on immediate conflict while maybe neglecting existential threats that affect everyone. And the decisions we make now or don't make have huge generational impacts.
Right. Like that example of a knee-jerk policy reaction to one problem causing unintended negative consequences elsewhere.
Yes. The rape case example leading to fewer opportunities for women in some sectors, it highlights the need for second, third-order thinking in strategy, not just the immediate effect.
Which is where red teaming comes in. Thinking like the adversary.
Exactly. Wargaming, deliberately exploring contrarian views, anticipating unexpected enemy moves, trying to find the flaws in your own plan before you execute it.
So pulling it all together, what was the sort of recommended shape of a response?
It seemed to be a kind of three-part approach.
Okay.
One, a measured show of force, some bloodletting perhaps for optics, reassurance for the security forces and the public.
Okay, acknowledging that need.
Two, a much broader, multi-pronged strategy to really disincentivize hostile actions, going beyond just military tit-for-tat, using economic, diplomatic, information levers.
Hurting them where it counts, even if it's not visible.
Right. And three, keeping an eye on the long-term goal, which is ultimately reducing enmity, eradicating the hostility, not necessarily the adversary themselves.
Building friendships, even with adversaries.
Good strategy involves that eventually. Look at the complex relationship with China, major economic partner, but also a strategic competitor, even adversary.
So Pakistan could potentially occupy a similar complex space someday.
It was suggested as a possibility. The real enemy perhaps isn't the people, but the concentration of power in the hands of a few,
Leading to decisions that don't reflect what most people want or need.
compared to more democratic, even if flawed, processes. So, for India, the focus should remain on treating Kashmir as an integral part, driving its progress.
Contrasting that with the likely situation in Pakistan-occupied areas, given their economic constraints.
Exactly. The long-term goal becomes essentially defanging the general's locust, as it was put, undermining their ability and incentive to instigate conflict.
And remembering their narrative is different.
Crucial. What people consume in Pakistan about past conflicts, about India, is likely vastly different from the narrative here. We saw the Yom Kippur War example,
Where Egypt's goal wasn't necessarily outright victory.
but maybe just being seen to confront Israel, to restore honor. We can't assume their motives mirror ours. Plus, Pakistan's geography, that lack of strategic depth, fuels insecurity.
And India's presence in Afghanistan adds to that.
It can exacerbate it, yes. Which feeds into why the Pakistani military might need the Indian threat narrative to justify its own existence and budget.
So direct communication to the Pakistani people. Could that help?
Potentially. Undermining the official narrative, we saw hints of that possibility even in Pakistan. Challenges to military authority, like during the Arab Spring elsewhere. Power isn't absolute.
Right, it goes back to resilience then.
Absolutely. Contrasting the brutal reality of war with casual rhetoric, the most effective Indian response, perhaps, is refusing to be terrorized.
Continuing to live normally, especially in Kashmir.
That act itself is a powerful strategic statement.
So in essence, this deep dive really underscores the need for a strategic, a multi-layered response to incidents like Pahalgam, one that looks way beyond just immediate retaliation.
Understanding motivations, vulnerabilities.
And ultimately, relying on our own resilience. See you soon with another one like this.